Good afternoon. I'm Tamika Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program titled Addressing Inequalities in Education Through Policy, Research, and Practice. This program is the first in a three-part series that will examine important policy questions as we begin a new year under new federal leadership. The series will bring together researchers and practitioners who will consider the current policy landscape, identify critical issues, and propose innovative solutions to them. I encourage you to join us again on January 28th, when we will focus on critical public health issues, and on February 4th, when we will turn our attention to carceral systems. Before we begin, I want to thank my colleague, Sarah Bleich, a Carol K. Forsheimer professor and faculty director here at Radcliffe, as well as a professor of public health policy at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Sarah led the organizing committee for the series, and I'm grateful to her for her efforts. Sarah will soon be bringing her keen insights to the Biden administration, where she will serve as senior advisor on COVID-19 at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. The United States is in the midst of an education crisis that is preventing children across the country from reaching their full potential. This crisis is most acute in Black and Brown communities, reflecting long-standing racial inequities. The situation, exacerbated by COVID-19, is both serious and complex, but as we'll learn this afternoon, it is not intractable. We're joined in this discussion by three distinguished speakers at the forefront of education research and practice. They will help us understand the fundamental challenges we face as we work to address inequity in American K-12 education, and they'll offer a vision of a better way forward. I'm thrilled to welcome each of them to our virtual stage. We'll first hear from Prudence L. Carter, who is the E.H. and Mary E. Pardee Professor and Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Berkeley. Following Prudence's presentation, we'll watch a short video and then hear from Christopher Chatmon, who is the Chief Executive Officer and the co-founder of Kingmakers of Oakland. Before founding Kingmakers, Christopher was the Executive Director of the Office of African American Male Achievement and Deputy Chief of Equity for the Oakland Unified School District. Last but not least, our moderator is Deborah Jewell-Sherman, the Gregory Anrig Professor of Practice and Educational Leadership at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Deborah will lead today's discussion and then welcome your questions. If you're watching on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to submit a question at any time during this program. We ask that you keep your questions short so that we can address as many of them as possible in the time we have. And now it is my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Dean Prudence Carter.
Thank you very much, Dean Brown-Nagin, and thank you to the Radcliffe Institute for inviting me to be a part of this event today. I see that the West Coast is well represented with my brother Chris Chatmon here in Oakland, and it's always a pleasure to be in the room, even if it's a virtual room with him. I appreciate your introduction, and I can also appreciate the gravity of the problem that we're wrestling with in educational research, practice, and policy, and that is the issue of how inequality is very likely exacerbated. It's not likely, we know that it is exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic. And the question is, where do we go from here? How can we minimize and eradicate the kinds of inequalities that are being propagated daily as we think about the high increased unemployment rate at a macro level? If we think about the unemployment rate having an impact on children's very immediate and proximate circumstances, the increase then in homelessness among some kids, food insecurity if the income has been drastically curtailed or cut. And then we also have to think about the issue of what the virus itself is doing in terms of the social and emotional well-being of children in this country. It is the case, as we know from the epidemiological data, that African American and Latinx and indigenous youth are more likely to be exposed to parents and grandparents and relatives who are dying from the disease, because the incidence of deaths and hospitalizations and deaths are nearly 1.8 to 2% greater than that of their white and Asian counterparts. And so we know that there are going to be significant increases in compounding of inequality. And we also know that prior to the pandemic, at least 30% of those children from those subgroups were living in poverty. And it is the case that in the United States, when it comes to children and youth under the age of 18, nearly 2/3 or so, rather about 60% of youth who are considered Black, Brown, and Indigenous are living within 200% of the poverty line. So the economic vulnerability is something that permeates the walls of schools. And as I've often written and said, that any walls that tend to try to separate schools and what happens inside of schools from what's happening externally are an illusion. Indeed, they will permeate and they do have a drastic impact on the overall well-being. Hungry children, traumatized children, and so forth may be, and more, may be entering our school districts. And so the question is what can we do about it? And how do we think about inequality in this moment? And particularly with the new day and the dawning of a new administration, where can the Department of Education and state departments of education go as we think about these things? And I've been thinking a lot about what we are learning under the conditions of the pandemic, and particularly what I'm learning, not only as a scholar, researcher, and administrator, but I'm also learning as a parent and watching a 7-year-old go through first grade virtually this year and thinking a lot about how to reimagine schools post-COVID. And that question is something that is posed to me quite often by journalists and others thinking, what do we know? We do know from just some brand new and early research that the children who are getting exposure to, let's say, more individualized inputs, there is some suggestion that the tutorial programs and the learning hubs that have arisen in certain districts and communities around the country have been able to mitigate to some extent the kind of learning setbacks that kids may have. We know that the tutoring is helping. So that begs the question of whether or not at the state and national levels, we may want to augment how we think about national tutoring programs. In fact, in the United Kingdom, we know that there is the case that there was a national tutoring program implemented during the time of COVID to actually minimize the adverse impacts. The second thing that we have to think about, and especially if it's getting back to school, I think in this moment, there's so much politics that's been imposed on top of science, but we have to think about the safety. It is the time for us to now realize and to just become comfortable, not comfortable, but to realize and just accept the fact that we are in a period where we're going to have vast climate change effects on schools. We actually have this pandemic and we don't know, dare say, will there be future ones that we have to adapt to? So what are the consequences and implications for schooling and teaching? We may have to augment and improve and develop our system of hybrid learning in this society so that we have have our teachers and our educators actually facile and adaptive to being able to move from the classroom to the virtual space. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that with advancing technology in our society, in the era of Zoom, in the era of increased artificial intelligence, where it is that machines may very well be doing a lot of the things that many of us were probably trained when we were young to do, then we might need to think about how learning and curriculum might have to adapt and change over time so that we are prepared for what could be the new future. What is our new normal? What is our new reality? So this is a time and a ripe time to also be contending with what we are teaching in our schools and the fundamental purposes of the curriculum. The inequality that we talk about also, when it comes from an economic standpoint, has been um, coupled with what we've all experienced, and which has been around for hundreds of years, and that's the racial injustice. And I cannot not talk about that today. This is the era, this is the year when America woke up to structural racism. And we've known that structural racism, many of us have known that it's been around for centuries. And there have been scholars arguing about this for 50 or 60 years, more than that, if we go back to the period of Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and others. And in this moment of racial injustice and structural racism, is an opportune time to tinker with what we understand as anti-racist or anti-bias curriculum, to tinker with what we know as culturally affirming and culturally sustaining, because research actually shows that those kinds of curricula have a positive impact on the overall academic well-being of African American and Latinx and Indigenous and Asian youth. And it's important for us to think about these things. It's important for us to also not think that these things just belong to those groups, but that actually we might need to be teaching history in a better, in a deeper way. And we can tell that from just the kinds of things we've seen happen in our nation, in our nation's capital, in the public sphere. So thinking about what it is we're teaching today to keep kids not only deeply engaged, but also to advance the common and the public good for education. In my own work, one of the things that I have been arguing over the last few years as I grapple with the macro and the meso and micro level issues of inequality is that education in our country over the last centuries have become what arguably too much of a private good, such that we see it as something that we consume and we gather and accumulate in terms of credentials, and we get ours and we get that for our children. And in the process, many of us collude with the dynamics of inequality because we become comfortable with segregation, both racial and economic segregation. We become comfortable with various forms of exclusion. We end up becoming comfortable with NIMBY attitudes, not in my backyard, when school districts actually try to attend to lottery systems and opening up so that there's more socioeconomic and racial diversity. Those kinds of mindsets, I will argue, lend themselves more to thinking about education as a private good. And certainly other people have also argued this. So how can we move schooling in the future to think about it more as a public good that will benefit the democracy? We know from the events of the last several weeks that civic education really, that the events are actually begging for civic education. They're begging for increased and deeper knowledge about history. They're begging for us to understand how we can utilize schooling and education to promote and cultivate a population of citizens who are attendant and attuned and coherent around what it means to have a healthy, inclusive democracy. So I think one of the things to think about is also how we actually attend to moving schooling more around a civics education, and not just the kind of narrow metrics that many of us are using to ascertain whether or not a child is bright, the standards that are embedded in a cross-sectional test. And then I'll say this last thing and I'll pass the floor over to Brother Chatmon. And that is the question of right now of how the angst that has come out of this pandemic, as we've thought about being at home for 11 months now, many of us, although there are many districts that are back in place, the damaging narratives of racialized achievement gaps in the more recent construct of learning loss. There is a lot of anxiety in our society about what this pandemic is doing in terms of learning loss. So it's the cousin to the achievement gap discourse. What it does, I argue, is that it ignores the social construction of learning, the malleability of what we construct that children should know at a particular point in time. And it's also predicated on metrics of what children knew then versus what they know now, without thinking about these things are historically contingent. In fact, what we expect first graders to know today were very different from what we expected first graders to know 40 years ago. If it is the case that there is some delay or not picking up, and I wouldn't call it delay, that there is a difference in this moment of what children are learning, I would say that it doesn't in any way it doesn't cease our ability. It doesn't decline or impede our ability to make sure that children can learn those things at another point in time, because learning is a part of the full-time developmental progress. Learning is lifelong. And there could be a more holistic way to understand the capacities, the competencies, and the resilience of our youth, particularly because they're moving to other skills just to survive this pandemic. So I do call into question our dependence and our reliance on these really narrow metrics that become embodied and embroiled in a controlling narrative about racialized achievement gaps in some ways, when it could be that our kids are actually picking up other skills. We don't know yet. The studies are yet to tell. So there are a number of considerations for us as we think about where policy and education needs to go. I would like for us to not just think about loss and deficit. I would like for us to be able to rely on the resilience and on the competences, and also the things that our children may be able to develop otherwise in a different way under these conditions. And I think our curricula need to do that. Secondly, in terms of practice, this is the right time for us to reconsider or to consider further what we are teaching our youth in America. And that is not just in urban areas, but that's suburban and rural and small town America too, so that we can actually ensure a stronger democracy in the next decades to come. So I am going to stop there, but I want to end with a quote from one of my favorite thinkers and writers, because I think that this quote really captures what I think when I imagine what we could be doing in the next decade. Arundhati Roy is the Indian poet, essayist, and thinker, and she wrote in the Indian Financial Times not long ago, back in April, I believe. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, or we can walk through lightly with little baggage, ready to imagine another world. I believe that we can reimagine education in American society as a fundamental social institution, given what we've learned from this pandemic, and even critically what we've learned from the amount of racial injustice and democratic unrest in our society. So thank you, and I'm going to turn over the virtual floor to Chris Chatmon, the CEO of the Oakland Kingmakers.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Prudence Carter, for your love, your light, and your leadership. I want to thank Dean Brown-Nagin and the Radcliffe Institute for giving me the opportunity to shine a light on the work we're doing here in California and the Pacific Northwest, but hopefully across this country. To provide a differentiated approach to today, I'm going to open with the video that tees up the work of Kingmakers of Oakland. Can we show the video, please?
When you look at the history of this country, Black children, Black people, Black consciousness, the Black physical body, the Black spirit is under daily assault and daily attack. And so we posit if we focus and are intentional and unapologetic around the needs of Black children, it actually will empower and engage all children and all families.
One of the big questions that is asked within the curriculum is, how do I see myself? And schools oftentimes give an answer to Black boys. See yourself as having a Black History Month. See yourself as in the lower track classes. So for us, this is not just a job. This is a necessity.
We can predict educational outcomes based on your gender, the neighborhood you live in, and the ethnicity. That is racial inequity at its finest.
It's important for people that do this work to come with that same sense of urgency.
I know we will have moved the bar to the next level when public schools across the country actually move beyond 10th grade ethnic studies courses or Black History Month to literally rewriting curriculum in this country.
When you see a young king, understand that he's not an N-word. When you see a young king, understand his potential, where you can see how bringing out Black genius works.
Now is the time really to lean into these institutions and rewrite a whole new narrative.
We just wanted to be clear that this is about the love of Black boys. This is about the love of our children. This is about giving our lives as best we can to create a new world for them.
Black boy, better listen close. When your elder speaking, better have the most respect, and I'll teach you how to get it. We ain't always gotta act like opposition. No, I got the wisdom, I'ma share it with you. If my life a movie, want you in the picture. If I got some time, I can kick it with you. Chop it up, tell me what's been on your mind. Pardon my absence, we back on the grind. Get in the jump on them, don't fall behind. Breaking down barriers one at a time. I'll give you the game to strengthen your spine. Aiming for greatness, don't settle for fine. Men on a mission, don't step out of line. Vision is vivid like king in his prime. I got a dream, we all sending divine. Peace in the streets, no heat for police. Mom and pops in love, check cash every week. Work piled up, resume on fleek. Got my passport stamp, motherland next month. Every move that I make ain't average, bro. Come now, king, let me sign you up. Built a whole castle for you to run. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, make it happen right here. Like king.
This hate for this fire that I bring. What I speak is in my veins, in my genes. Right, wrong, stand strong in the scene. In between, what you mean, what you mean. I'm king. For this hate for this fire that I bring. What I speak is in my veins, in my genes. Right, wrong, stand strong in the scene. In between, what you mean, what you mean. I'm king.
Clap it up, a virtual clap it up. Shout out those kings who wrote that song. Both Obasi and Amari are alumni from the Kingmakers program that was born out of Oakland Unified School District. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and start my time because I know time is of the essence. And my first slide, I'm gonna start with who we are. Kingmakers of Oakland is a leadership development and change organization committed to fundamentally transforming the education system and build the capacity of people to design and sustain thriving and liberated systems, structures, conditions, and culture to improve educational and life outcomes for Black boys. Our core assumptions, our educational system was not created to educate all children equally and to high standards, and therefore results in inequity by design. The policies, practices, and cultural representations or ways of knowing and communicating what is normal, right, and valued in schools advantages some groups, students, and disadvantages others. We believe educational transformation is possible. Making progress on equity requires us to have honest conversations about race and systemic oppression, not to lay blame, but to design more equitable systems. We must move from calling you out to calling you in. We frame our work around healing the fish while treating and transforming the toxic ecosystem. In this case, the fish are our kings, our Black students, male and female. We refer to our students as kings and queens. The heaviest lift in the public school system, referred to as the ecology, the ecosystem, is really adult mindsets. What adds to the toxicity that fuels and feeds the school to prison pipeline for Black children, brown children, indigenous children, and Southeast Asian children is school culture and conditions prevent African-American males from achieving. The harsh discipline policies that we see not only in school, but we see in life, feed and fuel the school to prison pipeline and add to the toxicity of us sending our children to school. Unequipped teachers, we have to rewrite and retrain teachers in our teacher prep programs, our administrative programs, and we have to be intentional on creating teacher pipelines, in particular that have Black and brown students at the core. One of the heaviest lifts in perpetuating white supremacy and the toxic ecosystem is Eurocentricity, that we have to rewrite content and curriculum from preschool through 12th grade in language arts, math, in science, in history, and all the elective classes, and not substantiate Eurocentricity with the 10th grade ethnic studies course. And last, but not least, what adds to the toxic ecosystem is the discrimination and criminalization from corporate hip hop and negative media, television. And whoever controls the narrative has the power in this country and in the, so we have to think very differently around narrative change. The 6 areas that we work with districts across the country are more relevant now than ever. One I referenced is around culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy, that we need content that affirms our children, our kings and our queens. And if we're preparing children for the global economy, that all children fail when their lens is through a Eurocentric understanding of the world. That actually white children and other children need to know African history, Pan-Africanism, and history of our Latinx and Chicano and Rasa studies as well. We have to work with our unions, our districts, to identify those curators of the culture and culture keepers in our neighborhood and fast track their entryway and on-ramp into public school teaching. And so we work with school systems on how to navigate and create those systems. We have to elevate youth voice and leadership now more than ever, because no one has figured this out. Sister Prudence talked about the ramifications of COVID. We are all students right now. And if we are not designing with students from the margin at the center, then we're really perpetuating these prehistoric systems and structures that we could predict those educational outcomes. So we have to elevate youth voice and elevate youth leadership. Every decision that we're making regarding students should be at that place as well, helping shape and inform the decision. Community family engagement. We have to see parents, family as assets and begin to mine the cultural mecca within the Black community and begin to leverage those assets from a full service community school standpoint to align those assets with the teachers, with the paras, with the classified staff, central office, and with the ecology, so we can go farther, faster, and accelerate learning. Talked a little bit about narrative change. We have to move from the problem of practice to the promise of practice. Public school systems, communication departments do 2 things well: crisis communication and reactionary communication, and they focus on the problem and have really normalized failure in Black and brown children. So we have to change not only the discourse, but how we're talking about and celebrating the collective of this. But if we policy, the culture eats policy for breakfast. So we have to understand the rituals and the culture are rituals of resistance that then we bind with policy, the administrative regulations, and then get the budget to support that. We work with districts around a cross-functional intergenerational team of students, families, teachers, school leaders, district leaders, city officials, and community members. Part of the perpetuation of white supremacy, of these structures, is the fact the higher you go, the more influence and the more access you have to budget, but yet the more disconnected you are from the people you're being charged to serve. So we have to change the leadership model and locate a cross-functional intergenerational team at the helm. So at this point, it is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Deborah Jewell-Sherman, who will lead our discussion. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. Thank you and Prudence for those wonderful introductory remarks, and off to a great start. I'm going to dive right into the questions so that the audience can hear from you further. Both of you spoke about the ecosystem that surrounds the education of our children. I'd like to start with you, Prudence, if you would. Just speak to us of how you have seen successful districts or a successful district, for example, navigate around the income, health, and educational fragility that was already in place. Are there any stellar examples that people might look to?
Thank you. There are a number of case study districts and schools, and more likely more schools than districts that where we can find successful, approaches. But let's be honest about what it takes with those successful districts. They have the infusion of resources, whether it's in both public and private resources. They figured out also how to unfold, as Chris has talked about, how to basically encompass also the families into the system. They know that one of the most critical inputs are the teachers who are well trained and trained not only in just their subject matter content, but they're also trained to understand history and economics and politics and psychology so that they can actually scaffold their children and engage them in anti-bias and anti-racist learning. But from what I can understand, here's what the national data show us. And I'm drawing on the data set at Stanford University produced by Sean Reardon and his colleagues. What they have been able to show by looking at all 13,000 districts in the country or more is that if you're just looking at test scores, that kind of narrow single metric, it is the case that the poorest districts in this country, very few of them are having test scores where the median is above the national median.
Right.
If you're looking at affluent districts, almost all of them are at or above the national, right? But there is variation within. So it's not terribly, even among those that are mostly low income and poor districts, you have variation where some of those districts are doing better than other districts. And even among the affluent, you have some of those are doing better than others. So then you go in, you do a deeper dive and you think about, well, what are those components? And the core components, as we know, is that you do have to have a certain level of adequacy and sufficiency. And you have to have a critical mass of engaged, critically thinking teachers and those who can, and the curriculum matters. We now know from even research that certain types of curricula are even effective, as Chris was talking about, that culturally affirming and culturally sustaining curricula. And so those inputs will vary even within classes or strata of districts.
Okay.
So that's where we go.
Okay, thank you so much. Chris, you spoke about the ecosystem at length, about engaging parents, community, schools. Can you give us specific examples of how you do that? We know that it should be done, but it is not an easy task. How have you built a relationship? Well, I know you worked for Oakland, but how does one build a relationship so that you can have that proximity, can have those connections, you can use community assets?
Yeah, a myriad of different ways. I think all of this goes at the speed of trust and relationship. So making sure, and hopefully my internet is not too choppy, but creating authentic places and spaces where families can be in community, be it back to school nights, under the distance learning domain of having game nights and theme nights where families can come together and get to know each other. Identifying a particular culture keeper on a block or in a neighborhood that has a street cred and relationship with other parents that may not see the school as a positive, that could begin to build relationships and make connections to the teacher, to the school staff, and to central office. And so there's a myriad of ways, but first it's really around relationship. And things that we found that was very successful regarding engaging our Black families was celebrating our kings and queens. When we recognize their children, recognize our children, our folks showed up and showed out, from our African-American honor roll celebrations to our perfect score celebrations to students that.
I know that Chris is going to unfreeze in just a moment, but while we're waiting for his internet to kick back in, Prudence, may I just inquire, what role do schools of education have in preparing teachers and administrators to do the yeoman's job that you so clearly articulated at the onset?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the fundamental questions, and I'm glad that I get to answer this question as a dean of a graduate school of education.
Absolutely.
We have been very, very at Berkeley, and I think in many of our schools of education across the country that know that this is a crisis in many ways. It's something that we have to, it's a national policy issue. It's foundational to who we are, is that we actually have to make sure we have the right training. So often in many of the programs, it's just been focused on methods, teaching methods, and what the subject contact matter is. I know that I believe fundamentally that teachers need sociology of education classes. They need to understand what it means to have to generate pedagogically, culturally sustaining lesson plans and affirming. So being able to incorporate things that many people laughed at, even when the likes of people like Gloria Ladson-Billings, when she wrote The Dream Keepers, and I think of Geneva Gay, and I think of a number of people who were critical thinkers in critical pedagogy over the decades. It wasn't until more recently when there are experiments where economists can show that ethnic studies and teaching the background, the history critically of young people has a positive impact on their overall academic performance, that when people started to wake up. So now we saw, like San Francisco, for example, is a district that has taken that on. So it's important, I think, in terms of teacher education programs, that we get it right first. In terms of the training, the kinds of courses we offer. Many of us have moved to like 1-year programs, bam, 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 let's get it out. But we have to realize that a lot of our teachers, where 3/4 of them are white women, many of them come from middle-class backgrounds, they don't match the student demographics of their classrooms or their schools. Many of us grew up under the context of segregation and othering and boundaries. So we don't know. And then we know that there is also the miseducation for many of us about what history really did entail. So the graduate schools of education and teacher education programs actually have to make up or supplement or for a lot of that lack of knowledge. So I don't presume just because a person came out and is very smart and got an undergraduate degree at a very at a very elite school, that they actually have all of the resources to be
exactly.
And that's what we need to be doing in the schools of education.
Thank you so much. Craig, glad that you are back. Talk to us, if you would, about the pedagogy that you used. That rap that was at the end of your video seems to suggest that it's not business as usual for the Kingmakers.
No, we definitely leverage hip hop. We leverage the arts. Really, classroom spaces should create the conditions of creativity and imagination. And in actuality, they stifle that. And so we really create the rituals and routines that create a safe space. So we've developed the pedagogy of brotherhood, where our kings in our classes know who they are and whose they are, and see, moving away from the kind of the Eurocentric value of me, and I, self-gratification, I gotta make it, to the collective genius of the whole. That when we see the humanity in each other, and if one brother's struggling or one queen is struggling, how do we support them versus it's just that teacher's responsibility? And so we have 7 accredited courses in the state of California. We're also in Seattle Public Schools and Kent. But the idea of getting African-centered courses aligned with Common Core, accredited in the state of California through the University of California Office of the President, that actually meet the high school graduation requirement for English language arts, history, an elective course, and an art course. But really, it's around the rituals that engage our kings, that develop that shared sense of belonging, and then the process of them understanding who they are and whose they are. All of our classes are academically rigorous. They read complex texts. They understand and get a lot of support around writing to prove a point. And then we practice, and our kings love talking in a myriad of different ways. So we cultivate that and we support that. And so not only do we have the
Oh, shucky darn, it happened again, Prudence. So
Yeah.
you're not my fallback, but I am going to just segue back to you to ask about something you and Chris both spoke about, and that is the need to enhance the curriculum, to enrich the curriculum so that it is not just Eurocentric. That politically is not an easy sell, as we saw with the former president's 1776 attempt to rewrite, from my perspective, history. But even when you don't have a overt political pushback like that, it is not an easy task to get everyone to understand the richness of an Afrocentric infused curriculum and why it is beneficial not just to Black and Brown and Indigenous students, but to all Americans. In light of what happened on January 6th, can you speak to how we might be more persuasive in that argument?
Well, let me just cast the net wider. Thank you for that question, Deborah. I want to say it's not just Afrocentric. You know, I think about the notion and the concept of settler colonialism and why our indigenous brothers and sisters in this country
Absolutely.
are quite settled by that, by the fact that most of us don't know the history of genocide and the Native American condition in this country. And we, you know, it's also the fact of the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1800s, right? When you think about originally when Asian Americans were brought into this country and helped to lay the fundamental infrastructure from the railroads and such and built much of the West. When we think about, you know, of course, enslaved persons, I think of the 1619 Project, notwithstanding some of its historical inaccuracies and some of the critiques that historians whom I really, really respect have made of it. That project, though, did a public service to this nation because so many of us did not know just some of the basic content of that particular project. And so I do think that it is really important, and I would encourage a national commission that could be bipartisan, multipartisan, or bipartisan, that could come to work on content. Now, I know this is not new. And I don't want us to become embroiled in culture wars. But I think it's important if we're going to do a project around the historical standards that the commission opens itself up. And maybe we revisit and we go back to where we've come. But we know it was too narrow in the past. And when you look at textbooks, unfortunately, most of the action is left up to the states. So the state of Texas, for example, drives a lot of textbook sales, but the state of Texas also sets standards that can be very exclusionary in terms of what Texan children learn. California, the New York Times did a comparative analysis between what California textbooks say and what Texas textbooks. So we don't have a uniform standard across the country in these textbooks, right? But it is the case that kids in the Midwest, in the small and rural areas, and certainly, dare I say, those who attended schools where many of the insurrectionists attended, may not be getting the education they could be and should be getting. And how do we break, Deborah? I don't have the answer. I think framing, and I think political leadership that is open-minded and flexible is what it's going to take at the national level to get us to that point. Can we get there? I think it's possible to get there if we can also get more governors and state superintendents and stuff to be working in congruence with the process.
Okay. It is the question, isn't it?
Yes.
So I thank you both for answering my questions, but there are lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn to those. One of the questions that was asked, Chris, I think in light of your talking about how your Kings love to talk and how literacy is a real focus of the work that you've done, one of our questioners wants to know how in the traditional public schools they can use some of those strategies to enhance literacy among all students and specifically among young boys.
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of things. Identifying as we get to know the students in our classroom in the spirit of who they are, whose they are, understanding what text we can introduce in their lives that they see as relevant. Too many times, our students don't, the content that we are providing them that is antiquated or not relevant, there's no interest in wanting to read or and write because it's not relevant. And so I share one of the biggest opportunities we have is to get to know our kings, the community they come from. Alfred Tatum does a lot of work around literacy supports and text for our kings. We've referenced his curriculum in books. We too have a reading list of some 50 books that we work with schools around, but really is finding what kings are interested in, introducing text around that. And then the way that you can also, in understanding who they are, for example, one of our facilitators took a James Baldwin piece and then crosswalked it with a Kendrick Lamar song and had the kings look at both and then engage in some academic discourse around the relevance and the meaning make, both with Baldwin's piece and Kendrick Lamar. So I share that to say that really, if we listen to and understand who we're charged to serve, it's a lot easier than to kind of pull what text off our bookshelf or reference to then begin to think about how do you contextualize that.
I want to ask a follow up to that before your internet acts up, because this is so rich. So one of the people in the audience wants to know what advice you have for individual teachers. So Prudence pointed out that 75% of our teachers are white, middle class, and frequently women. How do they know about Kendrick Lamar? I mean, my students keep me current, thank God.
Yes.
But how does the average teacher learn about the culture, the things that are relevant for kings and queens, so that they can make those connections in their classrooms?
Yeah, well, again, taking time. Well, a couple of things. First, that teacher needs to know who they are, right? We don't need people that fall into teaching. We need people that teaching is their passion and their purpose. And with that, then love exactly who you are. Now take the time to get a sense of the children in your classroom, who their families are, their local history, their the broader culture and context of which the community they come from. I think adds to that, knowing if they listen, you have 2 ears to listen and 1 mouth to talk. Engage and lift up, elevate your students' voices, engage families, and out of that, if your true art is teaching, you'll be able to figure out how you take learning standards and calibrate that to the content and contextualize that in the lives of the children. And so you really got to let go of your ego, be who you are, and then immerse yourself really in the classroom, in the culture. And so just not relying on, television or the mute, like go to church, right? Have a meal, go to different places that you normally wouldn't be. And that's part of the beautiful struggle, right? I mean,
I love
Deborah, can I just jump in here for a moment?
Sure.
One of the concepts that I picked up from reading an article by Linda Darling Hammond and one of her colleagues is the idea of adaptive teaching. And to pick up on something Chris just said, is that with adaptive teaching, it's a trait and a quality of teachers who really get it. It's a part of your pedagogic practice to know that your teachers are sometimes your co-teachers, that sometimes you're going to learn information organically from the kids themselves so that they may bring up or invoke a cultural reference that you might have to go back and research, and then find a way to braid that with the standardized teaching tools that the teacher's familiar with, or to extend or expand or change. But this is what we know as adaptive teaching. In some, I get that from my undergraduates. You were saying from you were getting that. My undergraduates forced me to go back and tinker with my curriculum.
Absolutely.
With my syllabus, as well as how I'm going to craft the lecture for the day or the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you both. We only have time for a few more questions. There have been a number of questions in the chat box, and I think they speak to the issues you started with, Prudence, and that is all of the factors that are making this such a challenging time for our learners. The poverty, the food insecurity, and then you add all of those onto a fragile educational system that is at best not meeting the mark, and under these circumstances has our students really suffering from learning loss. What pressures can we bring to bear, or do you have any hopes regarding this administration as to food insecurities and some of the other economic impacts that are so adversely affecting families and by extension our children?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because one of the arguments that I've been making is that multidimensional economic and social problems require multidimensional solutions. Yeah. And it is really the case that the education departments can't do it alone. And so with the administrations from the national to the state, in my estimation, you have to have departments of education with the Department of Health and Human Services, working with the city councils at the local level, working with housing. Like, if we're going to talk about attacking the ecology, these things need to be aligned. And I often wonder how often the secretaries of these different divisions get together to think about the ecological project, because that would be an idea, right? Is that if we want to focus on America's youth and the next generation, and certainly it's adults too, how is it that these things are interconnected, and how do we create policy and craft it together coterminously or interdependently? That's a question that I would ask. I don't think schools can do it alone. I am the first and foremost to say that. But if that is the case, and we're going to start with the premise that inequality exists and it's just hard to get away with, then how fundamentally fair, I ask, is it for us to ask kids, and I use this analogy all the time, some of them grown up with access to elevators that go at the speed of a bullet train, some of them on escalators going up and up and up, and some of them on stairwells with missing handrails and broken steps. And we say you all get floor 12 at the same time, or floor 16 if we're thinking college graduation. How fundamentally fair is that? Now, it is the case, not to be overly deterministic, that some kids on the handrails are going to get to the escalators and the elevators because of Chris, because of his Kingmakers, because of programs around the country like that, because of other factors that can scaffold the kids. But on average, unless these programs are scaled across the country, it'll be harder for those kids on the broken stairwells to be like the kids on the escalators and elevators in terms of their
question. No question. Chris, I have to know, you talk about the queens, but I only see kings. So tell us, if you would, how you're working with young women as well.
Sure. Well, we can't have African-American male achievement without African-American female achievement. So let me just start there. I think, given our strategy was born out of Oakland Unified School District, and as a result of the data that our focus from a targeted universalism sense was Black boys based on the data. Our whole model and theory of action is based out of that, yet we work with districts where it's African-American achievement. So we have curriculum also for our queens, as well as adaptive curriculum that is heterogeneous. It's for not just Black boys and Black girls, but also all children. And we have other strategies. I think it's about offering safe space for kings and queens, and for students who identify as them and they as well. I think as we evolve, because we're not a plug and play, we really posit it's the process as product. And we, just to go back, that we really need measurements and measure around ending racism. And our systems are not tracking that. We're using these antiquated metrics that we're measuring the wrong things of where we have to measure where we want to go. But all that to say, we have an adaptive process that is intentional and unapologetic around the needs of Black boys, where that is the case based on data, and where it's Black girls, where you or Black children, I would say broad. We have the differentiation where under the auspices of African-American and targeted universalism, we go deep there. So it is adaptive and needs responsive, but the focus that we don't bend is around Pan-Africanism and how really is the birthplace of all. As Dolores Huerta introduces herself as an African. You know, we are all African, so it helps for all of us to know our history and her story. But hopefully that speaks a little bit to
No,
how
it
we
does.
embrace our
Thank you so
girls.
much.
Mhm.
So we have, I think, about 4 minutes left or less. So in a minute, I ask each of you to just think about a word of encouragement, a word of advice, something that you can say to the over 200 plus participants on this call that will help them as they seek to address the learning loss, the learning environments that students are in, the poverty that so many of our students are experiencing, and in some ways the lack of hope. What can we say so that those who are the caregivers and have to be the ones to teach and reach and engage our students can be hopeful so they can transmit that hope? What would you say to them? Prudence?
Well, first of all, I'm a hopeful person. I'm an optimistic person, primarily just personally as the granddaughter of sharecroppers who've managed to have that mobility. So I do believe that the poverty and the misfortune is not totally deterministic. Somewhat helped me, my parents, and a teacher, a good teacher put me on the track and the mobility that I am. And so I think if each of us can just do our bit, coupled with what the federal and state governments and the public and private sector can do to facilitate, I think that we can actually have a better world for many more youth than we have today. I think I have faith that the Biden and Harris administration is right now trying to take on big educational issues to at least attack the kind of macro level things. And for us in the classroom, it's important for us to have expanded thinking and adaptation and flexibility as we work with these children. Love them. That's the most important thing. Love them.
Yes. Thank you so much. And Chris, would you share a word?
Yes. Our forefathers and foremothers dealt with far more with far less. They didn't sacrifice their selves for us to not show up. So know who you are and whose you are. Align your passion with your purpose, and then when your profession is irrelevant because you're gonna get paid to do what you love to do. But the Calvary is not coming to save anybody, and there's not going to be there'll never be enough resources. We have to shift.
Absolutely.
We have to move from to we, knowing we need money, but it's about a will. How do we build will and create a movement? And we have another extraordinary time where going back is not an option because we already can predict the outcomes. So we must trailblaze and align with like-minded, like-spirited institutions, peoples, and trust and know that change gonna come.
All right.
Change gonna come.
Wow. Yeah, and we weren't necessarily born by a river. Thank you so much, Prudence. Thank you so much, Chris. This was so enlightening.
Thank you, Deborah.
Let me turn it back to our dean. Tamika Brown-Nagin is going to close out.
Thank you so much to our speakers, Prudence and Christopher, and thank you again to our moderator, Deborah. That was so rich and edifying, and I want to thank you for participating and to everyone for watching this afternoon and for your questions. Our policy series continues on Thursday, January 28th at 12 p.m. with a program on closing and reopening schools and workplaces, and the final program in this series about changing carceral systems will take place on Thursday, February 4th at 4 p.m. I hope you'll join us. For more information on these programs, please visit our website. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good evening.